14.11 may look small, but there's been some shifts in the metagame on what's actually the best comps, as well as a few sleeper comps that are surfacing in the off-meta section. Let's go ahead and hop into the TFT Academy tier list to find out what are the best comps currently in what order, as well as some of the off-meta comps we can surprise our opponents with. The tier list is relatively the same for this patch on 14.11, but there are some major shifts on what is on top versus what took a step or two back. And there's also a few new comps towards the B and C tiers if you want to play some experimental builds. And it's all represented here on the tier list for TFT Academy. If you ever have any feedback, please let us know in the comments below this video, or join our Discord server here in the top right, and then leave a comment on the server. Starting off at the top of the meta, we have Ashe again, but things did shift a little bit to make her back as number one. Duelists for a while actually took it away from Ashe, but then we figured out ways to optimize the Ashe comp, and now it's even stronger. And with the other things nerfed, Ashe is now basically the best carry in the game that could be played alongside snipers and wardens. A lot of times people like to open up with 2 sniper and frontline of some kind, so you want to play things like Senna, Caitlyn, plus 2 wardens. That's usually the best opener, but you can also play Storyweavers and itemize a Sivir, for example. And you're always going to want to be playing 4 sniper and 4 warden in the mid game on level 8. It's very straightforward. And you also a lot of times go for 6 sniper if you can, or 6 warden if you get a +1 warden crest or a sniper crown. Sniper crown is still the best prismatic start in the game because you get the rage blade and you get the center rolling. One of the main innovations to the comp is that people have figured out that you can also just kind of ditch the Ashe plan if you are contested and instead play for Aphelios as your primary. And that's pretty nice because I expect at least 2 Ashe players per lobby to be trying to play this comp. So it's always nice to have Aphelios as a back pocket. And that also gives you possibilities of maybe bridging out of that if you want to play into more of a faded line as opposed to playing 4 sniper for warden. Maybe you can go for 7 faded and then go back into Aphelios. So just as a different option, it's not something that you always have to look for. It's just nice to have alternatives if you are contested, because I do expect this comp to be contested a lot. One of the main things we kind of figured out in the previous patch is that Infinity Edge is actually more important than Last Whisper. You already have some form of sundering from Aphelios, and so it's not as big of a priority to build it as we thought it was compared to previous sets where if you played Ashe or some kind of range 80 without Last Whisper, you were in trouble. And then you also have the option of building Even Shroud because wardens are so tanky. If you get an Even Shroud, just go ahead and put it on another warden like Alawi, for example, or the Amumu. And then as for what is better to itemize versus Amumu and Alawi, it's shifting back and forth. It's actually still being debated. I think people just basically come to the consensus of whatever you feel like you're going to upgrade first. So if you have like Alawi pair and 1 Amumu, then try to go for the Alawi itemization because you're much more likely to hit Alawi 2. But in reality, I think you just kind of itemize whatever you can hit. And if you can get a Mumu 3, it's really good. If you can get a Alawi 3, it's also really good. The other aspect about this composition is you're going to try to avoid getting stuck at level 8 because you do want to eventually play things like Syndra and Lillia as 4 costs. And that's also really nice because you might get some rods and tears that you don't want to use. You have to figure out an AP carry holder. You go to 9 and you play that. But this is a variation that plays 6 sniper. If you hit like a sniper emblem, just make sure you hold on to Kog'Maw or Caitlyn, get those cheap units, and go for 6 snipers at 9. Another thing worth considering is that there's a lot of exalted variations that have 1 sniper and 1 warden. So there's always, combinations of like Senna and Nautilus or Caitlyn and Amumu, things like that. There's like a bunch of different combinations of 1 sniper in the back and 1 warden in the front. And then you basically just throw in one of the other frontline options, and then you get 3 exalted on 9, which is really, really powerful. So it's somewhat flexible as your 9th unit, but the 8 units you want to play are generally the same. It's always these units minus Kog'Maw. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that a lot of times people get greedy with positioning. You want Senna next to Ashe for the AD buff because she gives AD to adjacent units. But sometimes in the late game, that ends up being the reason you lose, whether it's like mirrors against Nautilus or other things like that. So you do have to be careful about it. Also, just keep in mind that, Nautilus mana got nerfed, so it's a little bit weaker this patch. But in the end, it's still really, really strong. Ghostly Zyra was starting off at S tier at the beginning of last patch, and that was a little bit of a bold call for us because I don't think a lot of people put in S. People were putting in A and then moving it up over time. But now there's a consensus among the top players that Ghostly Zyra / Zoe is very good and can win lobbies. It's pretty flexible with your game plan as well, which is pretty cool. Sometimes you play for Zyra because you played a Caretaker's Ally, you get Zyra, and you lean into that. Other times, maybe you just have a good spot to play Zoe instead, and you play Zoe as your primary. One thing to note is that Zoe actually wants Shiv for her ability scaling, but you can also just build her as a straight up AP carry similar to Zyra. You can actually give her exactly the same Zyra items. In the end, I do feel like the best way to win the game is to actually go for both Zoe 3 and Zyra 3 and get items on them. Having just Zoe or just Zyra often means you top 4. If you have both of them 3-starred alongside like 3-star Shen in frontline, you're probably going to win the game. The burst that you stack with Ghostly Specters is just going to be so insane by the late stage of the fight, and it's almost worth just getting another Ghostly unit on the board just to stack more Specters. Haunted House as a result is pretty good, and if you get things like Trickster's Glass, for example, which duplicates another unit, you can put it on like Aatrox or Alawi, get more Ghostly units and stack more Ghost Specters. Shen is definitely the best frontline, but the reality is sometimes you can't hit it, especially if people are playing Shen hero augments or your contested Ghostly of some kind in the mid game. So just be open to what you roll for 3 stars. I've seen people also go for like 3-star Alawi or even reroll Riven in this composition and fully itemize. This is more pronounced when you take things like Prismatic Ticket and end up going into like reroll for all the 3 stars. And remember that Diana is something that's nice to have, but you just tech in like Sage at 8, just roll for these 7 units and try to get to 7. Don't try to roll too much on 6 because the board fits much nicer when you hit Morgana on 7 and your odds are not going to be that high. Not to mention that you can't get the 4 Ghostly in. So Prismatic Ticket, one of the best augments for this composition on a high econ portal like Crab Rave or Gold Subscription. 2LD did get nerfed, but it's still good for the comp. And ultimately, just taking a bunch of these strong AP augments like Magic Wand and Duelists 3 is really strong for this composition as well. Kind of similar to what we talked about with Aphelios for providing Sunder for snipers. You don't actually need anti-heal nearly as much for Zyra because her plants actually wound things. And so it's not that you don't ever need a Morello or anti-heal ever. It's just that it's not as big of a priority compared to a bunch of other things. Syndra technically got buffed this patch, although it's not necessarily a clean buff. At 2 stars, she's stronger, but 1 star, I think she might be weaker. Either way, that means that she caps higher than before, so she's now improved to be an S tier composition, and one of the main things that you play, especially off of a spatula opening, as part of what makes it really good, is that you can always use 1 Faded Emblem and 1 Dryad Emblem, and you can fit almost everything at 9. If you do get a Dryad Emblem, put it on a frontline unit so you get more HP. If you get a Faded Emblem, it's best on a Zyra so you can get the raw AP with linking Syndra and Ahri. It's not always Ahri and Syndra, but a lot of times it is. Sometimes you might want to link Set if the matchup dictates that you need some more Omnivamp. So just use a little bit of your critical thinking if you feel like a matchup is very dependent on like using a little bit more frontline like Thresh and Set versus just straight up backline damage and Ahri and Syndra. But yeah, do keep in mind that if you do have a Faded Emblem on a Zyra, that does mean that taking away his AP means he's a lot less effective. Some things that we've kind of realized is that Syndra with blue buff and Nashers is probably still the cleanest way to play Syndra, but the reality is you're just going to have to often play whatever mana items you can slam for tempo. So a lot of times people slam Shojin on Syndra and they play Shojin Nashers, which is not ideal, but it's fine. Sometimes you'd rather have Shojin because the item economy reasons, you just don't get 2 tiers and you can slam Shojin immediately. And it's really important to get the stacks. Not to mention that unless Syndra gets the early takedown, she doesn't actually benefit from the blue buff damage amplification. So in some matchups, Shojin and blue buff are almost no difference. And that's really for very specific things where Syndra wants to lock onto a target early and kill, like a frontline Lee Sin. But that matchup has changed a lot because Lee Sin got nerfed, or rather Duelist got nerfed. But you can still do the other builds for Syndra like double adaptive and death cap or other variations that we have shown in the past. This composition, very much like almost every other level 8, is that you don't want to get stuck on 8. If you can get to 9, that is usually the way you can seal the deal. And if you scale hard enough, they can't deal with your infinite amount of HP with Dryad. So very, very good. But boom, Jewel Lotus, all really, really good. Need to update this. Shopping Spree is not very good for this comp. So note to self, fix that for the next video. One thing I do want to say is Kindred is actually kind of a sneaky secondary damage source for a lot of the game. If you find a lot of Kindreds, or if you get it off of Caretaker's Ally. Kindred 3 can actually generate a ton of damage and even sometimes out DPS Syndra. So don't sleep on Kindred. It reminds me a little bit of like Aphelios in the Snipers comp or Kiana in Duelists. Just like this support DPS unit that might secretly actually be the real carry of the comp. Lillia is also really good in improving now that Duelists are falling. Duelists were a hard counter to Lillia. Even though Lillia could win those matchups, you just need to have immense value over the Duelists, and they could just play like a really cheap board and run you over. Lillia is best combo with Morgana as a secondary AoE carry, but the reality is you can actually flex a lot of different things. You could always just play Lillia Hui in the late game or Lillia Silas and kind of mix and match a bunch of different secondary carries. But just the reason why Lillia Morg is so good is because the synergies fit really nicely and they tend to snipe backline really well together. If you're trying to think about what Lilia's do, she uses her orb to deal AoE, and then Morgana's going to cast onto that clump and finish off those units. If you have like a different separate carry like Lillia and Silas going to try to kill the front line, Lilia's going to try to kill the back line, and you don't really have that synergy together. So Lillia and Morgana really prey on clumped backline. Like we talked about how Ashe tends to clump backline because they have their snipers paired together. If they're doing that and they're not separating, you can punish them. Same thing with Zoe Zyra. You can always just have like the AoE from Morgana shoot here as well as Lilia's orbs. The challenge with this board is that it's fairly expensive. It's really dependent on you kind of hitting all of your forecasts at 2 stars. Even though you don't have that many forecasts, being stuck on Lillia 1, Morgana 1 can just mean that you lose so much HP trying to stabilize. I've seen a lot of people like play Lillia 1, Morgana 1, and they transition out of their other carries. Like let's say they're playing Zoe 2 and they have like a good setup. They sell the Zoe for Lillia 1, and then they find Morgana 1, they play that. They end up losing a ton more HP. So just be very careful of downgrading your DPS because you don't actually have everything set up. Just like Syndra and Ashe, if you get stuck on 8 with this composition, you're going to be in trouble and you're probably playing for a top 4. This composition actually is much worse than other comps at level 8, in my opinion. If you get stuck there with 1-star Lillia and 1-star Morgana, you're probably going to go like 5th or 6th more often. So try to really get into a good econ spot if you can. And then as for items, Lillia really cares about just like Shojin because she's playing 2 Invoker as opposed to 4 Invoker with blue buff. We'll talk about that again a little bit in the Mythic setup. But Lillia really wants the AP because she wants to burst. And that's partially why things like Jewel Lotus is so good because you just give her a huge amount of burst alongside Morgana, hit a bunch of units, and quit the backline. One last thing about Lillia is that there's a lot of Exalted variations that play around Lillia or Nautilus. Try to keep an eye out for them and see if you get an excuse to play the Sage Lillia variation and find a way to get 3 Exalted because it is insane DPS in late game if you can do that. Irelia Fast 9 is still well and alive. It is like the comp that still does best in the stats, and there's just like infinite text that we could write about it. I mean, this is just a composition that's just really hard to pull off if you can get there, and is almost predicated on just like getting to level 10 and capping out. A lot of times with this composition, what you end up doing is you play a Storyweaver opener, and you're so strong and efficient on upgraded 2 cost and 3 cost that you just skip level 8 almost entirely because you're playing, you know, a bunch of upgraded units and you don't want to roll entirely for a new board. And then you just skip 8 and go to 9, roll until you hit like, you know, Irelia and a bunch of high value stuff, and then go to 10 and add in whatever unit you want. 4 Dragonlord is the core synergy for it, and this is just like a fast 9 comp that you're going to play every now and then. I'd probably say that even if you're trying to play this, unless you're Setsuko, you're probably not going to play this more than like once out of every 15 games or so. Because you just need so much econ and so many items and so many things to go right. Unless you're like really out-skilling the lobby or out-tempoing the lobby, I just don't think that you're going to pull it off practically. But it's good to include just so you have a frame of reference if you ever get to 9. Irelia 0 is really good. Irelia Hui has a good Exalted as well. Just play around those kinds of combinations. Now that Storied Champion has been nerfed, Kabuko is the top dog hero augment. And Kabuko is still really good, mainly because, well, I mean, 8 Bruisers is really good. And there's multiple variations that we're actually doing with this composition. This is actually a 2-for-1 comp. One is the Kabuko hero augment, but it's actually secretly also the way you play 8 Bruisers, meaning if you just get a Bruiser emblem start, whether it's through the crest or a dummy, you can just play 8 Bruisers and put 8 Bruiser on Irelia. That's because 8 Bruiser also helps the AD portion for Irelia, so she ends up doing a ton of damage. So 8 Bruiser is really good. You don't actually have to play Kabuko 3 if you don't have the hero augment, and instead just play for 8 Bruiser Irelia. But for the Kabuko game plan, it's pretty much like we did for the Garen one. You want to roll for 3-star Kabuko as fast as you can on stage 3-1. Make sure you level 4 so you maximize your odds, and then push levels. Don't worry if you have to roll like really deep to like 10 to 20 gold or less, because Kabuko will earn it back if you can get 3-star Kabuko with items. Kabuko's items are best Dragon's Claw and Redemption +1. Bramble Vest is nice for the AD matchups, but you could justify a couple different items instead of Bramble Vest. That's because Bramble Vest kind of sucks, but it's fine. Sometimes a lot of people put Spark, for example, on Kabuko. Silas takes over leftover items and eventually gets to Irelia. Azir is just nice to tie with Rek'Sai, but you could justify a bunch of different things. And this Kale could be a mixture of other things as well. It could be almost any Kale if you can justify a spot. But let's say you don't hit Irelia and you have the Bruiser setup that you want to go for. You can play it on like Kayn or other AD champions. But just keep in mind that in the end you want to land on Irelia. But hey, join the club. Pretty much everyone at this point wants to play Irelia in the top end unless you're playing a very specific composition. 7 Storyweaver is much better now this patch. And I think they've buffed Zoe enough. And people have just kind of realized that red, blue, blue Kale is a really good pathing for early game smoothness all the way to level 9. Before we kind of thought Storyweaver is like an 80 tempo composition that lands on Irelia, and then you played like Kaisa as your trick shot with Sivir, and then kind of transition to Irelia. But now with like Zoe being much stronger, it feels like the 7 Storyweaver is bridged as that gap because Zoe's a really strong unit, and now you can play like Allow Morgana, and you just end up doing like kind of a good mixture of like the Lillia Morgana Sage composition with Zoe Ghostly. It's just a good hybrid where you get a good amount of burst, and Kale now becomes your AoE nuker. So just good if you play around some of the early Storyweaver emblem stuff. You can still also play Find Vintage with it. And it's just pretty straightforward. There's almost nothing really different that you want to do from this guide. Just make sure you start building upon your Storyweaver momentum, and then get to 9 and play Irelia for the 7 Storyweaver. One thing to note about combat augments like Magic Wand, Jewel Lotus, Gifts of the Fallen, etc. is that it also buffs Kale. Kale is a unit on your board that benefits from these combat augments. And so that's partially why combat augments are so good in this, because Kale is a carry and you're giving combat power to her as well. And so just keep that in mind. If you take a combat augment, just remember that you want to ideally be to buff Kale. And so there's other combat augments you might get that aren't as good for this composition that might be confusing in the stats if you look it up. Small little pro tip as well, if you haven't heard already, tons of stats gives Irelia 4 starting mana. So that's a combat augment that actually specifically works really well in this kind of setup because it's buffing all of these units, plus Irelia gets 4 mana. Duelists are no longer the best standard comp in the game. Storied Champion Garen was the best comp, but that was very situational. Duelists were the big default leaning composition that people were always playing, and became the #1 comp that way, oriented around Lee Sin. Now it got nerfed pretty significantly. Qiyana got nerfed with 5 AD, Darius does less damage, and so in general that opener is worse, and you're not able to snowball your lead as easily. A big reason why Duelist was so good was just all the combat augments it abused. It just has so many different things that are good for Duelist on top of like Duelist Crest, and Find Vintage with all support items. The support items were particularly really good because you couldn't really low roll all your items. I made a whole video about it, how to one trick Duelist to Challenger, and that video still actually works this patch, but it's just not nearly as crazy abusable as it was. So you can definitely watch that video if you want to get a good understanding of Duelist and how to play it. Maybe not necessarily as a one trick, but to get a lot of information on it. The TLDR though is that Qiyana was really, really strong, and a lot of people wouldn't even take out Qiyana 2 in the late game. Like people would legitimately hit Wukong 2 and not even sell their Qiyana 2 because the Qiyana was just doing so much damage in the late game with all the combat augments. Volibear and Tristana 3 are only if you are really rich. Otherwise, you're just rolling for Lee Sin 2 on 8 and then pushing to 9, adding in more Dragonlord and potential Heavenly units. For Dragonlord, really good. There's also a lot of debate on 6 versus 8 Duelists versus 4 Dragonlord, because a lot of times you have to choose one or the other. And I personally think Darius and Yasuo late game are just really useless, but some people swear by 8 Duelists. I personally rather just play higher quality units, play for Dragonlord, and try to go for, another powerful unit instead. Storied Champion is worse now, and it's an A tier, but, it still can do well. You just can't take it every single spot like you did before. In the previous patch, it didn't matter if you have 0 Garens and no Garen items. You would just take it because it was that OP if you got 6 Warden online. Now it's much more tame because the mana nerf means he casts less often, which means he scales slower, and that's for every cast, so it's a big deal. And now Garen feels a lot more fair to deal with. The other thing about Garen is that people have to be careful with how they position. Yes, you do want him on the side, but sometimes it makes him exploitable because people would CC him. Against Duelists, for example, people would put Volibear and Lee Sin next to Garen to just chain stun him, so he couldn't really scale. Another thing we figured out is that Garen doesn't want Bloodthirster nearly as much as he wants Dragon's Claw. This is actually his best item alongside other things like Steric's Gauge, and then Titan's Resolve is also decent. But you could also justify a bunch of other different things, especially artifacts. There's a powerful amount of artifacts on him. The best Ornn items are Innervating Locket, Talisman of Ascension, and Silvermere Dawn. If you can get any of those 3, very, very good on him. Top end, you want to play around Irelia. And then you can have Zoe if you want for the Storyweaver or something else. And then you can also play 7 Storyweaver with Garen as well. You don't have to play 6 Warden. I personally like 6 Warden the best, but I've seen 7 Storyweaver succeed as well. I made another video on Garen reroll if you want to take a look at it, but just keep in mind, you can't get away nearly as much because this patch Garen is worse. Vertical Umbral is still pretty good this patch. You just kind of need to understand the spots you can play for it, and it usually just means that you kind of play from ahead. A lot of Umbral spots end up being a situation where you slam like Shojin or Morello early, and you have like Alune 1, maybe you hit Alune 2 really early, and you're angling for things like Zoe and Lillia, but you realize that you can just go into Umbral instead because you get a +1 Umbral emblem. That's usually how you bridge into it. Then you start building things like Silas items and kind of go into Umbral that way. But the thing is, you don't really roll for Alune 3. You go to 9, and then you roll for Alune 3 set and potentially some of the 5 costs. But it kind of depends on your setup. So, for example, one variation people are playing are like Lillia and Mythic. So you get like Tom Kench for the Bruiser with Silas and Nautilus for the Warden. So it kind of ties in really nicely. You can also play an Invoker variation. If you don't hit Irelia with Umbral Emblem, you can play for Azir, Lillia, Alune, and Annie. So you can play Invokers. There's a couple variations of Alune that's really cool. And now that Lee Sin and Duelists have been nerfed, one of its worst matchups, you can actually thrive a little bit against certain matchups in the metagame. I really like Alune, for example, up against Wardens because you can get passive damage reduction with True Damage Execute. So if you can punish some of those front lines really heavily, then Alune can really shine. It is really easy to bot forward this comp though if you're behind on tempo, and I've seen a lot of people like hit everything, but because they're just behind, they hit their items too late, they hit their champions too late, then they end up just bleeding out because this comp isn't infallible. It can lose to a lot of high cap situations, and then people are just stuck wondering why they bot forward with this composition. Make sure that you play it very cleanly from ahead. This variation is also similarly related to Midnight Siphon, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Essence Slot Alune is Archangel Staff Merlo plus a mana item. People are building Shojin a lot, but that's usually because of item economy. In the ideal world, you're not actually playing Shojin, you're playing like Adaptive Helm because Alune benefits off the raw AP as opposed to just the straight up mana. So if you're in a spot where you pick your items, you probably go for that. But like we said, a lot of times you're slamming things like Shojin, staying open to a bunch of different compositions, and then choosing to commit to Alune once you get the green light to go for it. Mythic Lillia is a variation you usually play with a +1 Mythic emblem, and it is powerful. It's just really hard to get online because it kind of depends on you hitting Hui and a bunch of other 4 costs. So it's an expensive vertical comp that can be pretty tricky, but if you do get it online, it is insane. And I do feel like people are playing 10 Mythic a lot if they get like, you know, 2 emblems of some sort. It's a very high cap situation that can win. It's also pretty good as a way to play into the Nico hero augment, which I guess we could just pull up here. You might as well just kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But Nico is basically the same thing with like Mythic, but instead you itemize Nico with Archangel Staff, BT, and Stone Plate. And then you give leftover AP items to Lillia or Hui, and then kind of play around Mythic this way. Early game plan is pretty straightforward. You want to play around Kog'Maw and the Mythic opener and just play around upgraded Mythics. Or you can play around other AP item holders, but make sure you kind of hold on to the Mythic frontline to transition at 7. The thing about Mythic Vertical is that people often feel like they want to play 7 Mythic ASAP no matter what if they get a +1 emblem, but the reality is you often have to play like good upgrades and probably 5 Mythic in the mid game. But as a fast 8 comp, you're going to rarely hit like everything on 8, so it's a little bit tricky in that sense. This variation plays 4 Invoker, and so you want blue buff. It just makes the mana break points much cleaner because Shojin is in intervals of 15 mana every time you auto versus blue buff is 10. And that's a big difference for the Invokers with Lillia. So just keep in mind, 4 Invoker, blue buff, Shojin on 2 Invoker. Other than that, pretty much the same thing as Sage Lillia, just that you're trying to play for the Mythic as your core as opposed to Sage and Heavenly. Hero Augment Shen, still fun, still the same build, still pretty hype, just double Rageblade and GS. One thing to keep in mind is that people are now putting Shen a lot more in the front rows for specific matchups. This is because Sage gives him the Omnivamp and allows Shen to potentially blitz a unit that's in the backline like a sniper. Snipers scale off of attack range, so sometimes you have Shen where Wukong is, kills like a Warden here on the edge, and then maybe can potentially focus on Ashe. And Ashe is doing less damage to Shen anyways because Shen has less distance between them. So that's one matchup you might push Shen a little bit further up. But other than that, pretty much just like a standard roll on 6, get 6 Behemoth online, get Shen 3 as fast as you can with the Rage Blades. Really good with Talisman Ascension as well. You can also put a Bramble on Shen as well because he scales off of armor instead of a Giant Slayer. Bloodthirster is also good as well with Harnesses. There's a lot of flexibility with the third item here for Shen. If you see people playing Ghostly, like Zoe, Zyra reroll, it can be really hard to hit Shen. So just keep in mind if people are angling that in your lobby, you either have to roll more aggressively or you might have to take like duplicator augments, or you probably shouldn't take it because if you see multiple people going for a Ghostly reroll, yeah, the Shen 3 is going to be really hard to hit. Dragonlord Xayah is another like level 9 comp that you're probably going to play once every 20 games, and this is just a variation for you to play if you hit a fortune cash out and you're in a spot that capitalize onto it. It really hasn't changed much, just playing around like the core of Dragonlords plus good 5 cost carry. So compared to Dragonlord Irelia is like Irelia plus an AP unit like Hui or Azir, and then just itemizing a bunch of 5-cost value. Xayah and Kaisa is just like a cheaper version where you can play like Ink Shadow and Dragonlords. So it's not nearly as insane because you're not really capitalizing on what makes Trick Shot really powerful, which is 4 Trick Shot, but it's still really good. We're just leaving it up here because sometimes you need a frame of reference of like, hey, I don't even know what the level 9 board looks like if I'm playing around like AD Fast 9, like a pure AD Fast 9. So this could be like one thing to play for if you're rolling on 9 for Irelia and you don't hit. Heavenly Kayn we had as 2 separate comps with like Heavenly Variation featuring Lee Sin and like Heavenly Variation versus Kayn. We're kind of just like showing you both variations that people play now. And now you kind of just make sure you play dual melee carry. Instead of having, you know, a bunch of duelists with, you know, Kiana 2 and Volibear and Tristana, kind of all pack it into one punch of Kayn. And it's really good with little buddies in particular. I think this is like the augment that you want as a trigger for you to like, you know, get a lot of power and juice into the composition. But you can't get little buddies till 3-2 or 4-2. So it's a little bit of a gamba. Like you open up Divine Rolls and Heavenly Crest, and then you really hope you hit things like little buddies later on. Lee is the best holder of Heavenly Emblem. Just give him a bunch of tankiness and stats, and then give him Bloodthirster Engage. Kayn's items are pretty much the same. Edge of Night plus Healing and Last Whisper, but you don't have to have Last Whisper on him if you have other forms of armor reduction, and then just give items to Wukong. Very tempo-oriented, and the benefit is that Kayn is still uncontested. Even though they got buffed, Kayn doesn't feel like that much stronger, so you still should be able to hit it. And now that Duelists have been nerfed, maybe people are contesting Lee Sin less often. So something to think about. Kayn and Lee Sin are positioned here to try to bulldoze the frontline units so that they can wrap to the back line. Just make sure you keep them together. If you have Kayn separate from Lee Sin, they're not going to kill units as fast, and you're going to separate your armor reduction. So yeah, just keep that in mind. This comp also changes to like S tier, like in the upper S tiers, based off of one Exalted, and that's Malphite, Kayn, and Lee Sin. That one is ridiculous. So it just gives you all the reason to play this comp. So expect that comp to be contested on that Exalted, but if you find a way to be solo uncontested with it, you might just win the game. B and C tier, as usual, is situational comps that can do well, and let's just go ahead and break down like the situations you might see them very quickly. Not going to spend the most time trying to map out their macro. Yorick Hero Augment Midnight Siphon is pretty straightforward. Just basically play it with Midnight Siphon. It's much better when you have a Umbral opening and you get it at 3-2 as opposed to 2-1. I know a lot of people who are fans of this on ladder but hate it in tournament because in tournament, the reality is Yorick can't keep up with a lot of the DPS in the late game and people build really good boards. And it's going to be hard to stabilize unless you roll for Yorick 3 and Alune 3. But it's kind of weird because you want to push to level 9 and get all this online and then go for Yorick 3. So you kind of have a little bit of friction with like how you want to push your tempo versus roll for Yorick 3. Yorick really wants defensive items, so Redemption and Declaw, and then any other third item. We just put Talisman here just as an example of a really good third artifact. And then you really want to play around Alune and the usual Umbral stuff like we talked about before. If you do want to chase Yorick, try to roll on 7 and not 6, so that way you can get access to these 4 costs like Sylas and Ornn. You don't have to play Nas, you can play Annie. It's a very flexible unit outside of that. One thing also worth noting is that they did buff 6 Behemoths, so there is a chance that 6 Behemoth Yorick Hero Augment is also really good. Keep your eye out for that. Not entirely sure yet. Kog'Maw Reroll is Dish Soap's like least favorite comp like ever, I think, on this set. I don't even know why, but Dish Soap just refuses to play Kog'Maw. Even if he's slapped in the face with like 8 Kog'Maws on stage 2, he'd rather just sell them all for econ and push levels. So he's not a believer in it, but the ladder stats indicate that it's good, and people actually even play it on tournaments as well. So you can try it. Blue buff and Nashers are mandatory on Kog'Maw, and you kind of want to hit like all of these units as soon as you can at stage 3. I think that's probably the biggest reason why is that if you miss Kog'Maw 3 and Cho'Gath 3 and you don't hit it till like end of stage 3, that's just like too late you bought for. So I think that's why a lot of like good players don't want to play it. One portal that I think this is surprisingly good on is the Yorick starting portal, where like you get 7 slots for a team immediately. And that's because you're not really incentivized to level for a long time. So you can just spend all of your gold rolling and you can just field all the units for cheap. So yeah, you can just play it like in that portal. Also, I think because they buffed Mythic Emblem is like better now, and you can get 10 Mythic as well if you get like a good setup with the Sentinels. I don't know. I think Dishop's kind of a hater, and I think that this comp is actually not bad. That being said, I'm probably not going to play it myself. Sage Sylas. This comp, man, what a fall from grace. I kind of thought that it was like pushing S tier, but ended up falling and getting nerfed. Really hurt by the Galio and Sylas nerf. That ended up being like a 1-2 combo because they played off each other really well. Sylas would initiate, then Galio would tank away from him by taunting, and then Sylas would be able to run free. But because they're more weak now, it just becomes hard to justify. You play Morgana for a while once you hit it on 8, and then you sub Hui in once you hit it. It's usually a fallback of what you play if you are missing on Lillia. One thing that's kind of interesting is that you can kind of fuse Lillia with Sylas because they both play Sage Core. This variant, instead of playing around like Lillia, Nautilus, Alawi, and like Nico, you can instead play Galio, Sylas, and Bruisers with Storyweaver, and it actually kind of fuses really nicely together. And so this ends up being like a fallback comp / hybrid comp because you could even just do the same concept, just put in Lillia here and then tech in some Mythic. So play around with it. It's a really hard comp to pull off. I did a whole video on Sage Sylas Flex that you could check out, but that was before the nerf. That being said, good players still play it, still get results, and are able to climb a lot of LP. It's a fun comp to play, hard to master, and very easy to bot for. Another angle you could go for in this is if you're playing for like a Ghostly, Zyra, Zoe reroll, and just kind of realize you're contested and you need to pivot. You could just put, items on Sylas and then the Shojin Morel somewhere else and then pivot out. Trickshot Kai'Sa got buffed, so it's better this patch, but still kind of struggles because the problem wasn't really the damage for Trickshot. It was always the front line, the previous patch, because they nerfed 2 out of the 4 core units of Sylas Galio. So Kai'Sa can still do well, especially out of Fortune cash outs, but you do end up struggling a lot if your front line is not upgraded. Galio 2 in general, as builds become more refined and people are skipping frontline because they're playing, Lillia, Morgana, and bursting backline, Galio's kind of a fraud. And even in the matches where you kind of need him to tank, like Sniper Warden, he doesn't actually tank that reliably because if you put him like here towards the center, he actually kind of gets worse value off of the sniper, and then he ends up dying, getting bursted. So comp's all right. I would mainly play this off of Fortune or maybe like a really powerful augment like Little Buddies. So I think that's probably the situation I would play it, and you get a bunch of 80 items that you can't justify playing Ashe. Other than that, I wouldn't really be looking to play this that often in the metagame. Bard is simply an artifact check. Wit's End, really good for Bard. Forbidden Idol, really good on Tahm Kench. Eternal Winter actually ends up being the best artifact item in general on Tahm Kench as well, so maybe worth updating that. Eternal Winter outperforms Out Forbidden Idol, and I think Anima Visage is also really, really good on Tahm Kench. Just basically trying to make TK unkillable of some kind and scale Bard 3. This comp actually won some tournament games at TSI as well, which is like the big China mid-set invitational. So it even performed at the very, very top level and won the game. Shout out to Pau Bull from France. He really showed up that tournament. Shenna reroll is like okay, but it's just less consistent than the AP reroll variations. I'd rather play Zoe Zyra 2 than Senna 3. But if you do get Senna because of caretakers, or I don't know, maybe you get like a Senna 2 start, Senna 2 appears on Carousel with the Gnar encounter, and you're just like, man, I should just go for Senna 3. Like, it can do okay. And it did technically get buffed because they buffed 8 Ghostly, so your vertical can be potentially stronger if you get 8 Ghostly. That might be something worth considering. But overall, I'm not that excited to play Senna compared to some of the other Ghostly or even Shen reroll. Like if someone's playing Shen reroll, it's gonna be hard to hit Shen 3. You're already in trouble. So I would generally stay away from it unless that happens. Gnar reroll can actually do well in the tournament for Tactician's Cup. Gnar reroll can actually do well in the tournaments this past weekend for Tactician's Cup. Gnar actually did very well in the stats, but only a few games were played of him. And it's largely due to either hitting Gnar and Kindred 3 very fast through tempo because you have a really good start for it, or you get like an artifact like Silvermere Dawn, which is really powerful on Gnar, and you get like double healing items on him. Vampiric Scepter, also worth noting, an item on Gnar as well. Kindred's best artifact is Lichbane. So in kind of a way, it's like an artifact check. Maybe you should put like Portable Forge on Gnar to show you that you can hit like multiple artifacts, but the idea is that it's conditional and you're not really looking to play this that often. The cap of it is pretty high though. I've seen it win lobbies multiple times. I think in the Americas, for example, it was played 5 games over 2 days and it won 4 of them, but only played 5 times. So there you go. Zoe Arcanist, this is like Disso's pet comp. He actually plays a couple times to a top finish in the Tactician's Cup #2, where he got a 2nd place. And it's really predicated on you hitting 3-star frontline, because we all know how good Zoe 3 is, but if you're stuck in Mumu 2, Alawi 2, you can be struggling a lot. So just give this a try if you have an Arcanist set up +1, or you're able to get like prismatic tickets and a bunch of rolls and 3-star your front line. Oh, Lissandra actually got buffed as well. So you know what, this comp is actually maybe not so bad. They buffed several things about it, and maybe it's well positioned in the metagame. I mean, if multiple people are playing Wardens though, like Warden snipers, how hard is it going to be to hit Alawi and Mumu? Like pretty hard. Yeah, I'd be very careful and hesitant about it unless I feel like the spot's really good. They did buff 5 Ink Shadow. last patch, and it's okay. You could play like 5 Ink Shadow, 4 Ghost in the mid game, but 7 Ink Shadow is still all right. Just kind of depends on your tempo for the most part. This comp also kind of struggles to win a lot of lobbies because it feels like you're just playing Jax and Volibear and Senna. These are just low value units in late game unless you're building around them, and we're just not. So it can be kind of tricky. I think the real key is with Ink Shadows that you want to actually push levels and play around the 5 cost. If you can get Udyr 2, Xayah 2, or even like Irelia 2 and find a way to get Ink Shadow Emblem onto her with like other ink tattoos, it could be really, really good. For the most part, I really wouldn't play it unless I have like a crazy Ink Shadow start with a emblem or getting it off the Wandering Trainers. Jaina Reroll technically got buffed because Diana 3 got stronger, so your frontline got better. It's just one of those things where you kind of need so many things to go right, and now Zoe is very, very contested. So before you used to benefit from not being contested by some of the other AP rerollers, but now it's going to be hard to hit. People are even just playing this core as a way to level to 8 and 9, and they're not even trying to grief you. So yeah, it's really tough to hit unless you get like the perfect start for it and you get mana items for Janet. So yeah, it's just really hard to hit unless you get like the perfect start for it. And even if you have Janet 2, I've had Janet 2 with like Shojin to start things off, and I still like win-lose on stage 2. Just one of those things where a lot of things have to go right with you to go for this comp. I would very rarely play it. And if you do, you're often just either like crushing the lobby into like an easy top 2 or like you're 5th. Fine Vintage, not really a comp anymore with the Zizerats. I think that ship has sailed, so not really as good. People in general take Fine Vintage and play into existing compositions like Duelists or Storyweavers, and then they call it a day. So I wouldn't necessarily play Fine Vintage straight up. I'd probably just go into Duelist, for example, with Fine Vintage and stack support items. Team Lux is a new composition reroll over the past week or two, and it's kind of been around most of the set, but only starting to hit popularity now. And it functions similarly to like a Lillia Morgana, where the whole point is for you to snipe backline because Teemos must shoot bounce and then Lux shoots the backline unit. So you can really punish people for bad positioning and really tag team a lot of one-star backline. But that being said, it's really, really hard to pull off because you kind of need to hit like all of these units. You need to hit Teemo 3 and Lux 3, and you need to have items for them, and you need to hit Mumu 3. It kind of feels like Nar Kindred, where you need to hit both of the 3-star 2 costs, but also have 3 items for both. Then you need, on top of that, you need like a Mumu 3. It's ridiculous. I will say if you fit Exalted with it, it's pretty good. There's like a Lux Teemo Exalted straight up, and then there's other variations you can play with like the like Sivir, Amumu, and like Morgana. There's like different things you can do that can help tie in that damage and really go for a lot of stuff. So it's a fun build. I don't know how good it is, but it's done well in some lobbies, and people even played it in tournament. People also said you could play a Bruiser frontline instead of Warden because Bruiser with Sivir, Riven, and Galio link easy as well. That's something to consider if you want to try to play that variation as well. Ghostly Flex is back because they buffed 8 Ghostly, so it's definitely worth thinking about. It's a legitimate win condition, but it's so situational because you kind of need 2 Ghostly emblems to pull off. But if you can get it, it's really, really powerful. The variation we're showing you is Kai'Sa, Xayah, and Udyr for Ink Shadow, but you could play Ashe with Caitlyn, for example, and get snipers and play like a Mumu. You could also go for Syndra with Faded, which actually we can just show you this as a variation as well. This is like Ghostly Syndra. So it's a little bit different functionally. This is much more AP oriented, so you're playing like, Ionic Spark and a bunch of AP items and splashing things on Morgana. This variation is much more like AD centric, so it's just like showing you different flex variants. Again, I would only try this if I get like an excuse to go for a bunch of Ghostly, like a Spatula Star, or I get a Sentinel with a Ghostly emblem. Porcelain Ashe is still C. It's a variation of Ashe you can play, but not something that I'm excited to. It's kind of like if you hit Lillia and you hit Ashe and you're kind of in between, you have a Porcelain emblem, you can go for it. Porcelain Ashe is still really good if you can get 6 Porcelain online, and so the Porcelain emblem is kind of mandatory, putting it in that C tier territory alongside, other like emblem dependent compositions. But you'd much rather just streamline by playing Ashe with Warden Sniper because it's cheaper and more effective. And if you're playing Lillia, you'd rather play the more effective version alongside Morgana that actually aligns with her ability to snipe backline. So this variation is pretty much retired at this point. But it's something to think about if you get a Porcelain emblem in particular. Yone got buffed, and if you want to focus on Yone as opposed to Kha'Zix, you can. This is still the variation that you can play. nothing much has really changed. I don't think people really want Yone to come back in the meta, quite honestly, because Yone would delete a lot of like snipers and Lillia comps. So I think I'm fine with it. Right now, these days, people just mainly play Yone in the Kha'Zix variations or something else. And then Build Different got buffed, but it's still pretty terrible, still averaging like almost a 5. So even though they got buffed this patch, we added a buffed tag to it. It's still not that good. So I would heavily stay away from it. They did buff Kayn and Lissandra, but they nerfed like Nautilus. So it's not like a clean 4-cost buff across the board. But if they ever do a small wave of buff of 4-cost, Build Different will be good again. Kha'Zix, this is a little bit fun one, but Kha'Zix has been getting a little bit of love. And now that they buffed Grim Harvest plus Kha'Zix 3, I actually think it might be in a pocket comp that people could play. Like, it's not necessarily as consistent and good, but if you get, Divine Rolls or Build a Bud and you get a random 3-star Kha'Zix, like, play around it. You'd be surprised how impressive he can be. Satsuko played Kha'Zix Reroll in tournament and got second. His only top 4 in his second day of competition, so something to note on top of the other meta comps. And you just play like the 4 Reaper variation with probably a Reaper emblem on Kiana or Morgana. We should add that. But it's kind of a new thing, and maybe it's more of a meme, but maybe people optimize it. Problem right now is that there's so little sample size, so the data is a little bit ambiguous, but I'm pretty sure double healing is really good on Kha'Zix, and you just get the 4 Reaper online and have him deal a ton of damage alongside Kayn 2. Probably not worth chasing Yone 3, though. So that's the update for 14.11. Not that many new comps at the top, but a few new toys to play with towards the B and C off meta stuff if you'd like. As always, we're going to update it daily, so make sure to keep checking back and see all the small little things that might be updated that even might be outdating this video. So check it out, tftacademy.com. Also, I started a podcast called TFT Study Hall with Disso, where we go over the weekly meta and cover some fundamentals, core concepts, and skills for you guys to potentially improve as a player. And hopefully by listening to that, you have a ability to improve without necessarily having to memorize what comps are good, because we're building the fundamental knowledge and skills. You can check it out at tft.com/podcast, or just check out the link below in the description. And if you do, please give us a follow and 5 stars on Spotify, because apparently they care about that for the algorithm stuff, just like YouTube. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.